Sometimes life puts us in a place where we must choose between our own comfort and helping a stranger in desperate need. In those moments, we discover who we truly are beneath all the walls we've built around our hearts. In the Colorado Territory, winter of 1887, Ezra Blackwood had spent 20 years living alone in his mountain cabin, avoiding the complications that came with caring about other folks. The blizzard that night was the worst he'd seen in years, with snow piling waist-deep and wind that could freeze a man solid. When 3 desperate knocks echoed through his cabin, he found a young woman at his door, soaked through and shivering, her belly round with a child ready to be born. She had nowhere else to go, and the nearest town was impossible to reach in this storm. What would happen when this hardened mountain man discovers the real reason she's running from her past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ezra Blackwood stared at the young woman swaying on his doorstep. Her dark hair plastered to her skull by melting snow, her face pale as winter moonlight. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, but her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much hardship too young. Her coat, once fine wool but now threadbare and soaked through, clung to her swollen belly like a second skin. "Please," she whispered through chattering teeth. One gloved hand pressed against the doorframe for support. "My baby, it's coming." Without another word, Ezra stepped aside and ushered her into the warmth of his cabin. The contrast between the howling wind outside and the crackling comfort of his stone fireplace seemed to emphasize just how close to death she'd wandered. He guided her to the old leather chair closest to the hearth, the one he'd salvaged from an abandoned homestead 15 years back. "Name's Ezra," he said quietly, already moving toward his kitchen area. "What do I call you?" "Sarah," she managed between shallow breaths. "Sarah May Caldwell." She paused as if the name tasted bitter. "Thank you for—" Another contraction seized her and she gripped the chair arms with white knuckles. Ezra had seen that look before, though it had been many years. The recognition hit him like a physical blow, transporting him back to field hospitals during the war between the states, to the screams of wounded soldiers and the metallic smell of blood mixing with gunpowder. He pushed the memories down where they belonged, buried deep with all the other ghosts he'd fled to these mountains to escape. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Started about an hour ago," Sarah said, her breathing evening out as the contraction passed. "Every few minutes now," Ezra nodded, already calculating. "In weather like this, with snow falling faster than a man could shovel it, there'd be no getting to Doc Peterson in Silverton. Hell, there'd be no getting anywhere. The narrow mountain trail that connected his cabin to civilization would be impassable for days, maybe weeks." He moved to an old wooden chest tucked beneath his kitchen window, the same chest he hadn't opened in 15 years. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the remnants of his past life, a leather medical kit that had saved more lives than he cared to count. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted it out, the familiar weight both comforting and terrifying. "You ever delivered a baby before?" Sarah asked, watching him with sharp eyes despite her exhaustion. "Been a while," Ezra replied, which was both true and a vast understatement. He'd delivered 3 babies during the war, 2 successfully, one that haunted him still. "But I've got steady hands and clean instruments." The cabin that had served as his sanctuary for 2 decades suddenly felt smaller with another person in it. Every corner held memories of solitude. The kitchen table, where he took his meals alone. The bookshelf lined with volumes he'd read by lamplight during endless winter nights. The bed where he'd slept dreamlessly, undisturbed by human connection or responsibility. Sarah's presence changed everything. She brought with her the scent of pine and snow, but underneath that something else: fear, desperation, and the indefinable essence of secrets. Ezra had lived alone long enough to recognize when someone was running from more than just a storm. "This your first child?" he asked, setting a kettle on the wood stove. "Yes." The word came out barely above a whisper. "I never thought I mean, I always imagined I'd have my mother there, or at least some other women folk." Her voice cracked. "Not alone in a stranger's cabin during the worst blizzard in memory?" Ezra studied her profile as she stared into the fire. There was something refined about her features, the kind of delicate bone structure that spoke of good breeding and soft living. Her hands, though work-roughened, bore the pale band of a recently removed ring. Whatever story had brought her to his door in the middle of a Colorado winter, it wasn't a simple one. "You're not alone," he said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "I may not be the company you choose, but I've seen enough of life to know that babies come when they're ready." Regardless of circumstances, another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and Sarah doubled over with a low moan. When it passed, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm scared." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw. Ezra felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he'd thought he'd killed off years ago. This young woman, barely more than a girl really, had trusted him with her life and the life of her unborn child. The magnitude of that trust settled on his shoulders like a familiar burden. "Fear's natural," he said, checking his medical supplies. "But fear can also keep you sharp, help you do what needs doing. I learned that during the war. You were a soldier? Medic, Army of the Potomac, 1862 to 1865. The words came out easier than he'd expected. He hadn't talked about the war with anyone in years. Saw my share of battlefield medicine, including bringing new life into the world when circumstances demanded it. Sarah nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'm grateful it's you who found me then. Or rather, that I found you." The wind outside howled with renewed fury, rattling the cabin's sturdy walls and sending snow spiraling past the frosted windows. Whatever had driven Sarah from her home and into this wilderness, she'd made her choice just in time. Another hour in that storm would have meant death for both mother and child. "Can you tell me what brought you out here?" Ezra asked, arranging clean cloths and boiling water. "Might help to know what we're dealing with." Sarah's face hardened, and for a moment she looked older than her years. "My husband," she said, the word dripping with bitterness. "Thomas Hartwell. He owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties, and he thinks that gives him the right to own people too. He hurt you. Every chance he got." She touched her cheek unconsciously, and Ezra noticed the faint yellow of a healing bruise along her jawline. "But when I told him about the baby, he got worse. Said it better be a son or I'd regret it. Said he'd make sure I never left the ranch again, never saw another soul besides him and his hired hands." Ezra's jaw tightened. He'd known men like Thomas Hartwell during the war. Officers who confused authority with brutality, who saw other human beings as property to be managed. The kind of men who created more enemies than allies and wondered why the world seemed set against them. "So you ran 3 days ago. Took nothing but the clothes on my back and what little money I'd hidden away." Sarah shifted in the chair, trying to find a comfortable position as another mild contraction rippled through her. "I was trying to reach the train station in Durango. Thought I could get to California, where my cousin lives. That's a hard journey for a woman in your condition. Harder than staying married to a man who promised to lock me away like some kind of broodmare." Her voice carried a strength that belied her fragile appearance. "I'd rather die free than live as his prisoner." Ezra understood that sentiment better than most. His own flight to these mountains had been driven by similar desperation, though his prison had been built from memories rather than marriage vows. The need to escape, to find some corner of the world where the past couldn't reach, that was something he recognized in every line of her body. "Well," he said, testing the temperature of the water heating on the stove, "looks like you've found yourself some temporary sanctuary. This storm's not letting up any time soon, and travel won't be possible for days. And then we'll figure out what comes next." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. When had he started thinking in terms of we? One crisis at a time, though. Right now, we've got a baby to bring into this world. As if summoned by his words, another contraction seized Sarah, this one strong enough to make her cry out. When it passed, They both knew the easy part of the evening was over. The real work was about to begin. The contractions came faster now, each one gripping Sarah with relentless intensity. Ezra had helped her to his bed, the only flat surface in the cabin suitable for what was coming. She'd removed her wet outer garments, and he'd given her one of his clean flannel shirts to wear. It hung on her small frame like a tent, but it was dry and warm. "This is happening faster than I expected," Sarah gasped between waves of pain. Her face was flushed, beaded with perspiration despite the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls. Ezra nodded grimly. First babies usually took their time, but nothing about this situation followed the normal rules. The stress of her journey, the exposure to cold, the fear, all of it had likely accelerated the labor. He moved efficiently around the small space, gathering supplies he hoped he wouldn't need, but feared he would. "I need to examine you," he said gently. "Check how things are progressing." Sarah nodded, biting her lip. Even in her pain, Ezra could see the trust she was placing in him, trust he wasn't sure he deserved. His hands hadn't delivered a baby since 1864, when Private Johnson's young wife had gone into labor during a temporary ceasefire outside Atlanta. That birth had gone well, but the memories it stirred brought back others that hadn't. As he conducted his examination, Sarah's body suddenly went rigid. But this wasn't a contraction. This was something else. Something wrong. "The baby's positioned wrong," Ezra said quietly, trying to keep alarm out of his voice. "Breech presentation. The baby's coming bottom first instead of head first." Sarah's eyes widened with terror. Even in her limited experience, she knew this was dangerous. "What does that mean? Is my baby going to die?" "Not if I can help it." Ezra's mind raced through everything he'd learned during the war, every desperate situation where he'd had to rely on instinct and prayer. Breech births were difficult under the best circumstances. In a remote cabin with limited supplies, they were potentially deadly. He reached into his medical kit and withdrew a small silver object that caught the firelight. Sarah's wedding ring, which she'd removed and hidden in her coat pocket days ago, fell onto the bed between them. The simple gold band seemed to mock them both, a symbol of the life she was fleeing, the conventional path that had led only to pain and captivity. Without hesitation, Sarah picked up the ring and hurled it into the fireplace. The gold wouldn't melt in the wood fire, but the gesture was clear enough. She was severing ties with her past, choosing an uncertain future over a guaranteed prison. "I'm not going back to him," she said through gritted teeth as another contraction seized her. "Whatever happens here, I'm not going back." Ezra felt something stir in his chest, admiration for her courage, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. He'd made his own dramatic break with the past, when he'd walked away from medicine and civilization. The difference was that Sarah's choice was being made in the crucible of childbirth. With life and death hanging in the balance, "You're not going anywhere except forward," he told her, his voice carrying more confidence than he felt. "But I need you to work with me. This baby's going to need both of us fighting for it." The next few hours blurred together in a haze of pain, effort, and desperate improvisation. Ezra had to use techniques he'd learned on battlefields, adapting them for the delicate work of bringing life into the world instead of preserving it after violence. His hands, steady from years of medical practice and then rough from years of mountain living, had to rediscover their old precision. Sarah proved stronger than her delicate appearance suggested. When the pain threatened to overwhelm her, she found reserves of determination that impressed even Ezra. She followed his instructions without question, trusting him completely, even when he asked her to push against every instinct her body was giving her. The baby's feet appeared first, tiny and perfect but frighteningly still. Ezra worked carefully, supporting the small body as it emerged, watching for signs of distress. This was the most dangerous part. If the head became stuck, both mother and child could be lost. "Almost there," he murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was reassuring Sarah or himself. "One more big push when I tell you." Sarah gathered herself for one final effort. The wind outside seemed to pause, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then with a sound that was part cry of pain and part roar of triumph, she gave everything she had. The baby slipped free into Ezra's waiting hands, small and slippery and blessedly alive. For a moment that stretched into eternity, the infant lay silent, and Ezra's heart nearly stopped. Then, as if remembering its purpose, the tiny chest expanded, and the cabin filled with the robust wail of a newborn, declaring its arrival to the world. "A girl," Ezra announced, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't expected. "A perfect, healthy girl." Sarah collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face as she laughed with relief and joy. "Let me see her. Please, let me see my daughter." Ezra cleaned the baby quickly, wrapped her in the cleanest cloth he could find, and placed her in Sarah's arms. The transformation was immediate and profound. Sarah's face, marked by exhaustion and pain just moments before, now glowed with an inner radiance that seemed to warm the entire cabin. "Hello, little one," Sarah whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist with one finger. "I'm your mama. We made it. We both made it." But even as mother and daughter bonded, Ezra noticed something that made his blood run cold. Sarah was bleeding, not the normal bleeding that followed childbirth, but something more serious. Her face was growing pale again, and her breathing was becoming shallow. "Sarah," he said urgently, moving to examine her, "I need you to stay awake. Look at me." She tried to focus on his face, but her eyelids were growing heavy. The baby, sensing something was wrong, began to fuss in her weakening arms. Ezra quickly took the infant and placed her in a makeshift nest of blankets near the fire, then returned to Sarah with fresh supplies from his medical kit. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Ezra's life. He worked frantically to stop the bleeding, using every technique he'd learned during the war, calling on skills he'd hoped never to need again. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her life ebbing away, even as her daughter's cries filled the cabin with the promise of the future. At one point, when her pulse was so weak he could barely find it, Sarah opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Promise me," she whispered. "If something happens to me, promise you'll take care of her. Don't let Thomas find her. Don't let him turn her into what he tried to make me." "You're going to take care of her yourself," Ezra replied firmly, though his hands never stopped their work. "I'm not letting you go anywhere." But even as he spoke the words, he made the promise in his heart. This woman had trusted him with everything, her life, her child's life, her hope for freedom. Whatever it cost him, whatever it demanded of him, he would honor that trust. Gradually, miraculously, the bleeding slowed and then stopped. Sarah's pulse grew stronger, her breathing deeper. Color began to return to her cheeks, and when she opened her eyes again, they were clear and focused. "Is she all right?" were her first words. Ezra brought the baby back to her, marveling at how natural they looked together despite the traumatic circumstances of the birth. "She's perfect. Strong lungs, good reflexes, all the right parts in all the right places." Sarah smiled, the first truly peaceful expression he'd seen on her face since she'd appeared at his door. "Then we did it. We actually did it." "We did," Ezra agreed, though he knew their real challenges were just beginning. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, a small miracle had taken place. A new life had entered the world, and in the process, 2 adults had discovered reserves of strength and courage they hadn't known they possessed. As Sarah nursed her daughter for the first time, Ezra cleaned up the evidence of the difficult birth. The simple tasks, washing instruments, changing bedding, banking the fire, gave him time to process what had just happened. For the first time in 20 years, he'd used his medical skills not to patch up the damage of human violence, but to help create new life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fled to these mountains to escape the responsibility of caring for others, to avoid the pain that came with forming human connections. Now, in the space of a single night, he'd become responsible for 2 lives and found that the prospect didn't terrify him as much as it should have. The baby's cries had softened to contented murmurs. Sarah, exhausted but alert, watched her daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a mother wolf. The wedding ring lay somewhere in the ashes of the fireplace, but neither of them gave it a second thought. That symbol of Sarah's old life had no place in whatever came next. As dawn approached, though it was impossible to tell through the heavy snow clouds, Ezra found himself looking at his cabin with new eyes. The space that had served as his hermitage for 2 decades would now need to accommodate a family, at least temporarily. The solitude he'd cultivated so carefully had been shattered by 3 desperate knocks on his door, and he discovered he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, echoing his own thoughts. "Now we rest," Ezra replied. "And then we figure out how to keep you both safe." But even as he spoke the words, he heard something that made his blood freeze. The distant sound of horses' hooves cutting through the snow, still far away, but getting closer. Someone was coming up the mountain trail, someone determined enough to risk the storm and the treacherous path. Sarah heard it too. Her face went white with terror, and she clutched her baby closer to her chest. "It's him," she whispered. "Thomas found me." Ezra moved to the window and peered out through the frost-covered glass. In the distance, barely visible through the swirling snow, he could make out the shapes of mounted riders, at least 4 of them, moving steadily toward his cabin despite the dangerous conditions. "How long until they get here?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with panic. Ezra calculated quickly. The trail was treacherous, but the riders seemed to know their way. An hour, maybe less. Sarah struggled to sit up, ignoring her exhaustion and the demands of her recovering body. "We have to run. We have to take the baby, and in this weather, with a newborn." Ezra shook his head firmly. "That's not running, that's suicide. Besides, where would we go? They'd track us easily in the snow. Then what do we do?" Ezra looked at her. This young woman who'd risked everything for freedom, who'd just brought new life into the world through sheer force of will, who was prepared to face death rather than return to captivity. Then he looked at the baby, innocent and vulnerable, depending on them for protection. His decision crystallized with startling clarity. For 20 years, he'd avoided taking stands, avoided getting involved in other people's problems. But some lines once crossed changed a man forever. Some responsibilities once accepted couldn't be abandoned. "We stand our ground," he said quietly. "This is my home, and you're under my protection. Whatever Thomas Hartwell wants, he'll have to go through me to get it." Sarah stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her expression. "You don't understand. He's rich, powerful. He has men, lawyers, judges in his pocket. He'll say I stole his child, that I'm an unfit mother." "Let him say whatever he wants," Ezra interrupted, already moving toward his gun cabinet. "Up here the only law that matters is the law of common decency. And that says a woman has the right to protect her child from a man who'd do them both harm." As the sound of approaching horses grew louder, Ezra prepared for a confrontation he'd spent 20 years avoiding. But as he checked his rifle and positioned himself near the window, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the calm certainty that comes from fighting for something worth protecting. The storm outside was beginning to ease, but inside the cabin, a different kind of tempest was about to begin. The baby's cries pierced the tense silence that had settled over the cabin. Ezra glanced back at Sarah, who was trying to soothe her daughter while keeping one eye on the frost-covered window. The approaching riders had stopped just within the tree line, probably assessing the situation before making their final approach. "She's hungry," Sarah whispered, her voice strained with exhaustion and fear. "But I'm so scared my milk won't come in properly with all this worry." Ezra moved away from his position at the window and knelt beside the bed. The baby, red-faced and squalling, had worked herself into quite a state. Without hesitation, he reached for the rough wool blanket he'd pulled from his own bedroll, the warmest, softest thing he owned. "Here," he said gently, wrapping the infant with practiced hands. Sometimes they just need to feel secure. To his surprise, the baby's cries softened almost immediately. Her tiny fist found its way out of the blanket and grasped his finger with startling strength. Something shifted in Ezra's chest as he looked down at the small face, now peaceful and alert, studying him with unfocused but curious eyes. "Look at that," Sarah breathed, a small smile breaking through her worry. She likes you. Ezra had delivered babies during the war, but he'd never had the luxury of time to actually observe one so closely. This tiny person was perfect in ways that seemed almost miraculous. Every fingernail perfectly formed, every eyelash a delicate masterpiece. The blanket that had kept him warm through countless lonely nights now served a far more important purpose. "What will you call her?" he asked, still transfixed by the baby's grip on his finger. "I've been thinking about that for months," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as she watched her daughter. "I kept hoping for a name that would give her strength, something that would remind her she can overcome whatever life throws at her." She paused, touching the baby's downy head. "I was thinking Hope, Hope Caldwell." "Hope," Ezra repeated, testing the name. It felt right somehow, appropriate for a child born in the midst of a storm to a mother fleeing violence, in a cabin that had known nothing but solitude for 2 decades. "It's a good name. A strong name." The sound of horses moving closer interrupted the peaceful moment. Ezra carefully handed Hope back to her mother and returned to his vigil at the window. The riders were advancing now, 4 men on horseback picking their way carefully through the snow-laden trees. "Can you see him?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with dread. Ezra peered through the glass, wiping away the frost with his sleeve. The lead rider was a big man, in an expensive coat, sitting his horse with the arrogance of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Even from a distance there was something in his bearing that spoke of violence barely held in check. "Big fellow, dark hair, fancy duds," Ezra reported. "That your husband?" Sarah's sharp intake of breath was answer enough. She clutched Hope closer, and the baby, sensing her mother's distress, began to fuss again. "He brought 3 of his men," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake Morrison, his foreman, he's the one who held me down while Thomas—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Ezra understood. "The other 2 are drifters he hired. They'll do whatever he tells them for the right price." Ezra nodded grimly. 4 armed men against 1, with a woman and newborn to protect. The odds weren't favorable, but he'd faced worse during the war. The difference was that back then, he'd been fighting for abstract concepts like country and duty. This time, he was fighting for something he could hold in his hands, the safety of 2 innocent lives. "Listen to me," he said, turning back to Sarah. "No matter what happens out there, you stay in here with Hope. There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. If things go badly, you take the baby and hide there until it's over. I won't leave you to face them alone," Sarah protested. "This is my fight, my responsibility. Your responsibility is that little girl." Ezra interrupted firmly. "She needs her mother alive, not heroic. Let me handle Thomas and his men." The horses stopped just outside the cabin. Ezra could hear low voices conferring, probably deciding on their approach. He checked his rifle one more time, made sure his revolver was loaded and within easy reach, then positioned himself where he could see the door and both windows. A heavy fist pounded on the wooden door, the sound echoing through the small space like thunder. Hope startled and began to cry again, her wails providing an unfortunate soundtrack to what was about to unfold. "Open up!" The voice was deep, cultured, but with an edge of barely controlled fury. "I know my wife is in there and I want her back. Now!" Ezra didn't respond immediately. He'd learned during the war that silence could be as powerful a weapon as any rifle. Let the other side show their hand first, reveal their intentions and their weaknesses. "I said, open this door." Thomas's voice rose, losing some of its cultured veneer. "That woman stole my unborn child and ran off like a thief in the night. I have every legal right to reclaim my property." The word property hit Ezra like a physical blow. In all his years of solitude, he'd almost forgotten how some men could reduce other human beings to mere possessions, things to be owned and controlled. The reminder of such casual cruelty stiffened his resolve. "This is private property," Ezra called out, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the door. "State your business or move along," a different voice spoke up, younger, harder. "We don't have business with you, old man. Just hand over the woman and her brat and nobody gets hurt." Sarah flinched at the crude words, pressing her face against Hope's blanket. The baby had quieted again, as if sensing the need for silence, but her dark eyes remained alert and watchful. "No one's getting handed over to anyone," Ezra replied evenly. "The lady's under my protection, and she'll stay that way as long as she chooses." Thomas's laugh was cold and harsh. "Protection? From a broken-down hermit living in a shack? Sarah, I know you can hear me. Stop this foolishness and come out here. You're embarrassing yourself and our family name." For a moment, Sarah looked as if she might actually respond, might try to reason with the man who had terrorized her for years. But then Hope made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a contented sigh, and Sarah's jaw set with new determination. "I'm not going anywhere with him," she said quietly, but with absolute certainty. "Whatever happens, I'm not putting my daughter in that man's hands." Ezra felt a surge of admiration for her courage. It would have been easy to give in, to trade temporary safety for long-term misery. Instead, she was choosing to fight for something better, even if the odds seemed impossible. "She's not coming out," Ezra announced through the door. "And neither am I. You want to discuss this further, you can do it from where you are." "This isn't a discussion," Thomas snarled, all pretense of civility gone. "That's my wife and my child in there, and I'm not leaving without them. You're harboring stolen property, and that makes you a criminal." "Funny thing about the law," Ezra replied, moving closer to the window to get a better look at their positions. "Up here in the high country, it tends to favor the side that's in the right, not the side with the most lawyers." He could see Thomas now, red-faced with rage, gesturing angrily at his men. The foreman, Morrison, was positioned to one side of the door, a rifle already in his hands. The other two had spread out, probably planning to cover the back of the cabin in case their quarry tried to run. "Last chance," Thomas called out. "Send her out now, or we come in and get her." "First man through that door won't be going home to his supper," Ezra warned, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd killed before and would do so again, if necessary. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Ezra could almost hear the calculations going on outside. 4 armed men against 1, but that one had the advantage of defensive position and, apparently, the will to use it. It was Morrison who broke first. "Hell with this talking," he growled. "Let's just burn him out. You set fire to that cabin with my child inside, and I'll kill you myself," Thomas snapped. "I want them alive and unharmed." "Then we go in hard and fast," one of the drifters suggested. "Hit the door and windows at the same time. Overwhelm him before he can do much damage." Ezra smiled grimly. They were making the classic mistake of treating this like a business transaction, something that could be resolved through superior numbers and intimidation. They didn't understand that they'd stumbled into a situation where a man had drawn a line in the snow and declared it uncrossable. Behind him, Sarah was humming softly to Hope, a lullaby that seemed incongruous against the backdrop of threatened violence. But there was something defiant about it too, a declaration that life and tenderness would continue even in the face of brutality. "Listen," Thomas tried one more time, his voice now taking on a wheedling tone. "Be reasonable about this. Sarah's not thinking clearly. Women get strange ideas after childbirth. Everyone knows that. She needs medical attention, proper care, not hiding out in some mountain hermit's cabin. I can make it worth your while to step aside." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Ezra had to admit it was tempting, not the money, but the easy way out. He could open the door, hand over Sarah and Hope, and return to his solitary existence as if none of this had ever happened. But then he looked at the baby in Sarah's arms, wrapped in his old blanket, trusting and vulnerable, and depending on him for protection. He thought about Sarah's courage in fleeing an abusive marriage, her determination to give her daughter a better life, her willingness to risk everything for freedom. And he thought about the man he'd been before the war broke him, the man who'd taken an oath to do no harm, who'd believed that protecting the innocent was the highest calling any person could answer. "No deal," he called out. "Find yourself another mountain to die on, Hartwell." "This one's taken." The response was immediate and violent. Morrison's rifle cracked, and the window beside Ezra exploded in a shower of glass and splinters. Ezra dropped to the floor, rolling toward his own weapon as more shots rang out from multiple directions. The war had come to his cabin at last. But this time, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The gunfire ceased as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind an eerie silence, broken only by the whistle of wind through the shattered window. Ezra remained crouched behind his overturned table, rifle ready, while Sarah huddled in the far corner with hope pressed against her chest. "That was just a warning," Thomas shouted from outside. "The next volley won't be aimed over your heads." Ezra peered carefully around the edge of the table. The cabin's sturdy log construction had absorbed the rifle rounds without much damage beyond the broken window. But the message was clear enough. These men were serious about taking Sarah and the baby one way or another. "Everyone all right?" Ezra asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though her face was pale with shock. Hope had startled at the loud noises, but seemed remarkably calm for a newborn who just experienced her first gunfight. The baby's dark eyes moved between her mother's face and the source of the commotion, as if trying to understand this strange new world she'd been born into. "She's not even a day old," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She shouldn't have to hear such things." Ezra felt something twist in his chest as he looked at the two of them, mother and child, innocent and vulnerable, caught in the crossfire of one man's possessive rage. The protective instinct that had stirred during the difficult birth now blazed into something fiercer. More determined, he moved carefully to his wooden chest, the one that had held his medical supplies, and withdrew something he'd hoped never to touch again. The military medal lay heavy in his palm, its bronze surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the clear inscription, "For valor above and beyond the call of duty." He'd earned it at Antietam, pulling wounded soldiers from under enemy fire when any sane man would have stayed in cover. "What's that?" Sarah asked, noticing the way he stared at the medal. "A reminder," Ezra said quietly, slipping it into his pocket, "of the man I used to be before I decided the world was too broken to fix." He'd fled to these mountains because he'd grown tired of violence, tired of patching up the damage men did to each other in the name of country or honor or simple greed. But looking at Sarah and Hope, he realized there were some battles worth fighting, not for abstract ideals, but for the simple right of innocent people to live free from harm. "You think there's a chance they'll just give up and leave?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Men like Thomas don't give up," Ezra replied, checking his ammunition. "They take what they want, and they destroy anyone who gets in their way. The only thing they respect is superior force. Then we're in trouble. It's 4 against 1, and they have us surrounded." Ezra smiled grimly. "Numbers aren't everything. I spent 3 years fighting battles where we were outnumbered. Sometimes the side that wants it more finds a way to win." Outside, they could hear the men moving around, probably positioning themselves for a coordinated assault. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air as he gave orders to the others. "Jake, you take the back wall. Billy, watch the side windows. Tommy, stay with me at the front door. When Mr. Hartwell gives the word, we go in hard and fast. What about the hermit?" one of the others asked. "He seemed pretty determined to make a fight of it, one old man with a rifle." Morrison laughed harshly. "We'll put him down quick and clean. The boss wants his wife and kid back, and that's what he's going to get." Ezra felt his jaw tighten at the casual way they discussed ending his life, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle. It was the same attitude he'd seen in too many men during the war, the belief that violence was just another tool, to be used without thought or conscience when it served their purposes. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to tell me about these men, what they're capable of, how they think." She shifted Hope to one arm and wiped tears from her eyes with her free hand. "Morrison's the worst of them. He's the one who helped Thomas hurt me. He enjoys it, the power over someone weaker. The other two are just hired guns, but they're mean enough. And Thomas?" Sarah's expression hardened. "He's not a fighter himself. He pays others to do his violence for him. But he's smart, calculating. He won't risk himself unless he's sure he can win. That information gave Ezra something to work with. If Thomas was staying back while his men took the risks, it suggested a possible strategy. Cut the head off the snake and the body might stop moving. There's something else, Sarah continued, her voice dropping even lower. Thomas has connections. Judges, sheriffs, politicians. Even if we somehow survive this, he'll find legal ways to take Hope from me. He'll claim I'm an unfit mother, that I kidnapped his child. One problem at a time, Ezra said, though privately he acknowledged the truth of her words. Raw courage wouldn't be enough to protect them from a man with money and influence. They'd need something more, evidence, allies, or simply distance enough to start fresh, where Thomas's reach couldn't follow. A new voice called out from near the cabin's front door. This is your final warning. Send out the woman and child and we'll let you live. Refuse and we'll burn you out. The threat of fire was the one thing that genuinely worried Ezra. The cabin would burn quickly in the dry mountain air, and there'd be no escape for Sarah and Hope if they were trapped inside. But giving in to the threat would be the same as signing their death warrants. Thomas wouldn't let Sarah live with the knowledge of his illegal marriage, and Hope would grow up as a tool in his hands. What do we do? Sarah asked, reading the concern in his expression. Ezra looked around the cabin that had been his sanctuary for 2 decades. Every log, every board, every nail had been placed by his own hands. It represented 20 years of solitude and self-reliance, 20 years of successfully avoiding exactly this kind of complication. But as his gaze settled on Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around her, he realized that some things were worth more than security. Some causes justified the risk of everything a man had built. We make our stand, he said simply, and we trust that doing right counts for something in this world. He moved to his gun cabinet and withdrew a second rifle, along with a box of ammunition. The weapons were well maintained despite their age, old habits from his military days. If Thomas and his men wanted a fight, they'd get one. Can you handle a rifle? He asked Sarah. She nodded. My father taught me before he died. I'm not a marksman, but I can hit what I aim at. Good. Take position by the side window. It's the one place they can't surround completely because of that old oak tree. If they rush the cabin, you cover that approach. What about Hope? Ezra looked at the baby, still wrapped in his blanket, still holding onto his finger whenever he came close. An idea began to form, desperate, perhaps even foolish, but their only real chance. I'm going to get you both out of here, he said. There's an old mine shaft about a quarter-mile up the ridge. It's hidden by deadfall and brush, but it goes deep enough to provide shelter. You can wait there while I deal with Thomas and his men. I won't leave you, Sarah began. You'll do exactly what I tell you, Ezra interrupted firmly. Because that little girl needs her mother alive, and I need to know you're both safe before I can do what needs doing. Sarah stared at him for a long moment, understanding passing between them. He wasn't talking about a tactical withdrawal. He was talking about a last stand, a final confrontation with odds that heavily favored the other side. There has to be another way, she said. Maybe, but if there isn't, I want you to promise me something. Ezra reached into his pocket and pulled out the medal, pressing it into her free hand. If I don't make it through this, you take Hope and you run. Get as far from Colorado as you can. Start fresh where Thomas can't find you. I can't take this, Sarah protested, trying to give back the medal. It's yours. You earned it, and now I'm earning it again, Ezra replied, by making sure you and Hope have a chance at the life you deserve. Outside, they could hear the men getting restless, their voices growing more aggressive as they worked themselves up for the assault. Time was running out for peaceful solutions, if any had ever existed. When I give the signal, you take Hope and go out the back window, Ezra instructed. Keep low, use the trees for cover, and don't look back no matter what you hear. Can you do that? Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. What about you? How will you get away? Ezra smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a smile without bitterness or regret. Don't worry about me. I've got a few tricks these boys haven't seen yet. He moved to the front window and called out to the men surrounding his cabin. Thomas Hartwell, I've got a proposition for you. I'm listening. came the reply. Single combat. You and me, no weapons, no interference from your boys. Winner takes all. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Ezra to wonder if he'd miscalculated. Then Thomas's laughter echoed across the clearing, harsh and mocking. You think I'm fool enough to risk myself fighting some broken-down hermit? My men will take what's mine, and you'll be dead in the next 10 minutes. Then I guess we understand each other perfectly, Ezra called back. No surrender, no quarter, no mercy. He turned to Sarah one final time. Remember, when you hear the shooting start, you go. Don't hesitate. Don't look back. Just run. Sarah reached out and touched his face with her free hand. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For bringing hope safely into this world. For protecting us. For giving us a chance. Ezra covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of human connection that he'd avoided for so many years. Thank you for trusting me. For letting an old hermit remember what it feels like to fight for something that matters. The moment was shattered by Morrison's voice, closer now and full of menace. Time's up, old man. We're coming in. Ezra kissed Sarah's forehead gently, then touched Hope's tiny hand one last time. Go, he said simply. Now. Sarah moved toward the back window, cradling Hope close to her chest. The baby seemed to sense the urgency, remaining quiet as her mother prepared to flee into the winter night. Ezra waited until he heard the soft sound of the window opening, then took his position at the front of the cabin. Outside, boots crunched in the snow as the 4 men moved into position for their final assault. Ezra felt the familiar calm that had come over him before every battle during the war. The strange peace of a man who had made his choice and accepted the consequences. Sarah, he called softly, not turning around. Are you clear? Yes, came her whispered reply from outside. We're in the trees. Ezra nodded to himself, then raised his rifle and aimed at the door. When the shooting started, it would be loud and violent and brief. But by then, the 2 people he was protecting would be safely away, hidden in the darkness and snow, where Thomas and his men couldn't follow. For the first time in 20 years, Ezra Blackwood felt like the man he'd been before the war changed him. And if this was to be his last battle, at least it would be fought for the right reasons. The assault came with the sudden violence of an avalanche. Morrison's boot crashed through the front door, just as rifle fire erupted from 2 other positions, filling the cabin with splinters and smoke. Ezra dropped behind his overturned table and returned fire, his first shot catching one of the drifters in the shoulder and spinning him around. But even as he fought, his mind was with Sarah and Hope, praying they had made it safely to the mine shaft. The sounds of battle, shouting men, cracking rifles, splintering wood, would carry clearly in the thin mountain air, but he had to trust that Sarah would resist the urge to look back. Where is she? Thomas's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere outside. Where's my wife? Morrison, bleeding from a graze across his temple, gestured wildly toward the back of the cabin. She's gone. Must have slipped out during the shooting. The firing stopped abruptly as the men realized their quarry had escaped. Ezra used the momentary silence to reload, knowing his respite would be brief. He'd bought Sarah and Hope time to get away, but now he faced the full fury of 4 angry men with nothing left to lose. Spread out, Thomas commanded. Find her! She can't have gone far with a newborn baby. Ezra heard boots moving through the snow around his cabin, the men fanning out to search for tracks. He had maybe 5 minutes before they picked up Sarah's trail, 5 minutes to do something that would give her more time to reach safety. Rising from his concealment, he moved quickly to the shattered front door. Morrison was reloading his rifle, his attention focused on the task, when Ezra's shot took him down for good. The foreman collapsed without a sound, his weapon falling useless into the snow. "Morrison!" Thomas screamed, his voice cracking with rage and disbelief. "Jake!" The remaining 2 hired guns converged on the cabin, their rifles blazing. Ezra retreated deeper inside, using the thick log walls for protection. Wood chips flew as bullets tore into the timber, but the sturdy construction held firm. "Burn him out," Thomas ordered. "I want that hermit dead, and I want my wife found." Through a gap in the wall, Ezra saw one of the men approaching with a burning branch from their campfire. If they succeeded in setting the cabin ablaze, his defensive position would become a death trap. But more importantly, the flames might create enough light and distraction to help Thomas's men track Sarah through the forest. He couldn't allow that to happen. Ezra burst through the back window in a move that surprised even himself. Rolling to his feet in the snow with his rifle ready, the man with the torch spun around, but Ezra's shot took him in the chest before he could bring his weapon to bear. "Two down," Ezra muttered, already moving toward better cover. The odds had improved, but Thomas and one gunman still remained, and they'd be more cautious now. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Thomas shouted from his position behind a large pine tree. "All I want is what's mine. My wife, my child. They're not your property," Ezra called back, circling through the trees to get a better angle on Thomas's position. "Sarah's free to choose her own path, and that baby's got a right to grow up without a tyrant for a father." Thomas's laugh was bitter and cold. "Free to choose? She married me legally and properly. She took vows before God and man to obey me. That makes her mine, and any child of hers belongs to me as well." The words revealed everything Ezra needed to know about Thomas Hartwell's character. This wasn't a man grieving for a lost family. This was someone enraged that his property had dared to escape his control. The distinction made Ezra's job easier, morally if not tactically. A rustling in the brush to his left warned Ezra that the last hired gun was trying to flank him. He spun and fired, but the shot went wide as the man dove for cover. Return fire splintered bark inches from Ezra's head, reminding him that professional killers were more dangerous than grieving husbands. The man, Billy, Ezra thought he'd heard Morrison call him, was good at his trade. He moved quietly through the forest, using the terrain and darkness to his advantage. Only years of military experience allowed Ezra to track his progress by sound and instinct. "Give it up, old man," Billy called out. "You're outgunned and outmanned. Surrender now, and maybe Mr. Hartwell will let you live." Ezra didn't waste breath on a response. He was conserving his ammunition now, making every shot count. The extended firefight had already used up more bullets than he'd have preferred, and he had no idea how long this confrontation might last. A new sound reached his ears, distant but growing closer. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving fast through the snow. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Perhaps someone in the valley had heard the gunfire and come to investigate. But as the riders drew nearer, his heart sank. "That'll be my boys from the ranch," Thomas called out triumphantly. "I brought reinforcements just in case. Now you're really outnumbered." Through the trees, Ezra caught glimpses of mounted men, at least 6 of them, all armed or loyal to Thomas Hartwell's money. The tactical situation had just shifted dramatically against him. Even if he could eliminate Billy and Thomas, he'd still face half a dozen fresh opponents. But something else caught his attention as the riders approached. One of the horses bore a different kind of rider, someone sitting straighter, wearing what looked like an official uniform. As the group entered the clearing around his cabin, Ezra saw the glint of a badge in the firelight. "This is U.S. Marshal Crawford," an authoritative voice rang out across the scene. "Drop your weapons and stand down, all of you." Thomas emerged from behind his tree, his rifle lowered but not abandoned. "Marshal Crawford, thank God you're here. This madman has kidnapped my wife and child." The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s, with steel-grey hair and hard eyes, surveyed the scene. The damaged cabin, the 2 bodies in the snow, the armed men positioned throughout the forest. His expression suggested he'd seen enough violence in his career to recognize the truth when he found it. "That's not exactly how I heard it, Hartwell," Crawford said slowly. "Got a wire from the territorial governor about some irregularities in your marriage certificate. Seems there might be questions about its validity." Ezra felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but the possibility of it. He'd sent no wire, knew no governor, but apparently Sarah's situation had come to the attention of higher authorities. Perhaps Thomas's influence wasn't as absolute as he'd believed. "That's preposterous." Thomas blustered, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice now. "My marriage to Sarah is perfectly legal. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Phillips in front of dozens of witnesses. "About that Reverend," Marshal Crawford said, pulling a document from his coat. "Turns out Jeremiah Phillips wasn't actually ordained by any recognized church. In fact, his real name is Jeremy Potts, and he's wanted in 3 states for fraud and confidence schemes." The silence that followed was profound. Even Billy, still hidden in the trees with his rifle, seemed to pause at this revelation. Ezra felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking together. Sarah's mysterious confidence about escaping her marriage, her insistence that Thomas had no legal claim to her or the baby. "You're lying," Thomas snarled, but his voice cracked with growing desperation. "Sarah is my wife. The child is my heir. According to the law," Marshal Crawford continued implacably, "no valid marriage ever took place. Which means Miss Sarah Caldwell is a free woman, and any child she bears belongs to her alone." Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of trapped desperation that made him more dangerous than ever. A man with nothing left to lose was capable of terrible things. "I don't care about your laws and your papers," Thomas screamed, raising his rifle toward the marshal. "Sarah belongs to me. I paid good money for that ceremony, spent a fortune on her, gave her everything she could want. She's not walking away from that." The moment crystallized with awful clarity. Thomas was beyond reason now, beyond law or conscience. He would kill anyone who stood between him and what he considered his property, including a federal marshal. Ezra's rifle spoke before Thomas could complete his aim. The shot echoed across the clearing with finality, and Thomas Hartwell crumpled into the snow, his weapon falling unused from lifeless fingers. Marshal Crawford nodded approvingly. "Good shooting." That man was about to commit murder in front of a federal officer. Billy emerged from the trees with his hands raised, his fight gone out of him with his employer's death. The other riders, Thomas's ranch hands, looked uncertain now, unsure whether their loyalty extended beyond their boss's life. "It's over," Marshal Crawford announced to the assembled men. "Mr. Hartwell's dead, his marriage was invalid, and Miss Caldwell is free to go where she pleases. Anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally." The ranch hands began to disperse, clearly having no desire to face federal authority without Thomas's money to back them up. Billy was secured with iron shackles, probably facing charges for his part in the assault on the cabin. But even as the immediate crisis passed, Ezra felt no sense of victory. Sarah and Hope were still out there in the cold mountain night, probably terrified by the sounds of battle. Unsure whether they were now safe or in even greater danger. "Marshal," Ezra said, lowering his rifle at last, "there's a woman and newborn baby hiding up in the old mine shaft. They need to know it's safe to come back." Crawford nodded. "Let's go get them then. This whole business has gone on long enough." As they made their way through the snow toward the ridge, Ezra found himself holding the wanted poster that had started it all, the legal document that had declared Sarah a kidnapper of her own child. Now it was just worthless paper, the foundation of Thomas's claims revealed as fraudulent from the beginning. Justice, it seemed, sometimes found a way to prevail after all. But Ezra knew the real test would come when they reached the mine shaft, when he'd have to look into Sarah's eyes and tell her that her nightmare was finally over. The climb to the old mine shaft seemed longer than Ezra remembered. Marshal Crawford followed behind him, along with 2 of his deputies who'd arrived with the larger group. The snow crunched under their boots, and their breath formed white clouds in the frigid air. Ezra carried his hunting rifle loosely in his hands, not as a weapon now, but as a tool of his trade, a familiar weight that had served him well through 2 decades of mountain living. The rifle represented his self-reliance, his ability to provide and protect, but tonight it had become something more. It had been the instrument of Sarah and Hope's freedom. "Sarah!" Ezra called out as they approached the hidden entrance to the mine shaft. "It's Ezra. It's safe now." For a long moment, there was no response except the whisper of wind through the pine boughs. Then faintly he heard movement from within the rocky opening. Ezra. Sarah's voice was thin with exhaustion and fear. Is it really over? It's over, he confirmed, setting his rifle aside and kneeling beside the entrance. Thomas is dead. The marshal's here, and he's got papers showing your marriage was never legal. You're free, Sarah. You and Hope are both free. The silence that followed stretched so long that Ezra began to worry. Then he heard something that made his throat tighten, the sound of Sarah weeping, but not from grief. These were tears of relief, of overwhelming gratitude, of a burden finally lifted after years of carrying it alone. She emerged from the mine shaft slowly. Hope clutched against her chest. The baby was wrapped in Ezra's blanket, but both mother and child were shivering from the cold and the strain of their ordeal. "Let me see those papers," Sarah said. Her voice stronger now, despite the tears streaming down her face. Marshal Crawford stepped forward and handed her the official documents. Jeremiah Phillips, or Jeremy Potts, his real name, has been running marriage scams across 3 territories. Your ceremony was invalid from the moment it was performed. In the eyes of the law, you were never married to Thomas Hartwell. Sarah read through the papers with growing amazement, her free hand trembling as she turned each page. "I knew something wasn't right about that preacher. He was nervous, kept making mistakes during the ceremony. But Thomas's father insisted he was legitimate, said he'd checked his credentials personally. Thomas's father was probably in on the scheme," Crawford said grimly. "Arranged for a fake marriage so his son could claim ownership of you and any children without the legal complications of an actual wife's rights." "But why?" Sarah asked, confusion mixing with her relief. What did they gain from such an elaborate deception? Crawford exchanged glances with Ezra before answering. "Your father's land, most likely. The property you inherited when he died. A fake marriage would give Thomas claim to it without having to honor your legal rights as a true wife." The pieces fell into place for Sarah with sickening clarity. Her father's ranch, the one Thomas had been so eager to help her manage after the funeral, the way he'd insisted on handling all the legal paperwork. She'd been manipulated from the very beginning, trapped in a web of lies and forged documents. "The ranch," she whispered. "He wanted my father's ranch, and he needed a wife to claim it legally. A wife he could control completely," Ezra added, his voice hard with anger. "Someone who wouldn't question his decisions or interfere with his plans." Hope stirred in Sarah's arms, making small sounds that suggested she was hungry. The baby's needs provided a welcome distraction from the grim revelations about Thomas's true motives. "Let's get you both back to the cabin," Ezra suggested. "It's warmer there, and the little one needs proper care." As they made their way down the mountain, Sarah walking between Ezra and Marshal Crawford for support, she asked the question that had been haunting her since the shooting stopped. "What happens now? I have no money, no home to return to, no family except Hope. Thomas may be dead, but his father is still alive, and he has lawyers. Connections. Thomas's father will have his own problems to deal with," Crawford assured her. "Conspiracy to commit fraud, falsifying legal documents, probably theft of your father's property. He won't have time or resources to cause you trouble. As for the immediate future," Ezra said quietly, "my cabin's always been too big for one person. You and Hope are welcome to stay as long as you need." Sarah looked at him with surprise and gratitude. "I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Ezra interrupted gently. "I'm offering. It's the least I can do after everything you've been through." When they reached the cabin, the damage from the gunfight was more apparent in the lamplight. The front door hung at an awkward angle, one window was completely shattered, and bullet holes marked several of the log walls. But the structure was still sound, and more importantly, it was warm and safe. While Marshal Crawford and his deputies dealt with the aftermath of the confrontation, removing bodies, securing evidence, taking statements, Ezra helped Sarah settle Hope in a makeshift cradle he'd fashioned from a wooden box and some blankets. "She's so peaceful," Sarah marveled, watching her daughter sleep despite the chaos of the night. "As if she knows the worst is behind us." "Babies are resilient," Ezra observed, remembering the children he'd seen during the war, somehow finding ways to sleep and eat and grow, even in the midst of terrible circumstances. They adapt to whatever world they're born into. I want her to grow up in a better world than the one I knew, Sarah said firmly. Free to make her own choices, to marry for love if she chooses to marry at all, to own property in her own name. Ezra nodded, understanding the fierce protectiveness that drove her words. Hope would grow up knowing her mother had fought for her freedom before she was even born, that she came into the world because someone had been brave enough to risk everything for her future. What will you name her? He asked, though he remembered Sarah mentioning it earlier. Hope, Sarah replied without hesitation. Hope Caldwell, because that's what she represents. Hope for something better. Marshal Crawford finished his business and prepared to leave with his prisoners and the bodies. Before departing, he pulled Ezra aside for a private conversation. That was good work tonight, Crawford said. Clean shooting, no innocent bystanders hurt, justice served. If you ever decide you want to pin on a badge again, the territorial government could use men like you. Ezra shook his head. I'm done with that life, Marshal. This was a one-time thing, protecting people who needed protection. Sometimes that's all the law really is, Crawford replied. People protecting other people who need protection. But I understand. You've earned your peace. After the lawmen departed, taking Billy and the bodies with them, an unusual quiet settled over the cabin. The silence was different from the solitude Ezra had known for 20 years. This was the companionable quiet of people who'd shared danger and survived it together. I keep expecting to wake up, Sarah said softly, sitting by the fire with Hope in her arms. To discover this is all a dream, and I'm still trapped in that house with Thomas. It's real, Ezra assured her. You're free, Hope is safe, and Thomas can never hurt either of you again. Because of you. Sarah looked at him with an expression that combined gratitude, admiration, and something deeper. You risked your life for strangers, gave up your solitude to protect us. Why? Ezra considered the question carefully. A day ago he might not have been able to answer it, but now, watching Sarah with her daughter, seeing the peace on both their faces, he understood his motivation with perfect clarity. 20 years ago, I walked away from the world because I thought it was too broken to fix, he said. But tonight I learned that sometimes you don't have to fix the whole world. Sometimes it's enough to fix one small piece of it. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she'd appeared at his door. You did more than fix something, Ezra. You gave us our lives back. Hope stirred and opened her dark eyes, focusing on Ezra's face with the intense curiosity of a newborn discovering her surroundings. When he offered her his finger, she grasped it with surprising strength, holding on as if she understood that this man had played a crucial role in bringing her safely into the world. What do you think, little Hope? Sarah asked her daughter. Should we stay here with the man who saved us? The baby made a small, contented sound that might have been coincidence but seemed like approval. Sarah laughed, a sound of pure joy that filled the cabin with warmth. For Ezra, the moment felt like a turning point, though toward what future he couldn't yet say. His life of solitude was over, that much was certain. Whether what came next would be better or worse remained to be seen. But for the first time in 20 years, he was looking forward to finding out. Outside, the storm that had brought Sarah to his door was finally beginning to clear. Through the bullet-shattered window, he could see stars appearing between the dissipating clouds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, practical decisions about the future that would need careful thought and planning. But tonight, it was enough that they were all alive, all safe, all free. The broken door could be repaired, the shattered window replaced, the bullet holes patched. What mattered was that this cabin, which had sheltered one lonely man for 2 decades, had become the birthplace of something new, a family forged not by blood or law, but by shared danger and mutual protection. Hope yawned and closed her eyes again, her tiny hand still gripping Ezra's finger. In her peaceful sleep, she seemed to embody her name, a promise that tomorrow could indeed be better than yesterday, that sometimes courage and compassion were enough to overcome even the darkest circumstances. As Sarah settled back to rest and Ezra banked the fire for the night, Both of them were already beginning to envision the life they might build together in this remote mountain sanctuary. A life where hope could grow up free and safe, where Sarah could heal from her ordeal, and where Ezra could rediscover the man he'd been before the war taught him to expect the worst from human nature. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer empty. And for now, that was more than enough. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation that changed everything. The cabin had been repaired, its wounds from the gunfight patched with fresh wood and new glass. Sarah had regained her strength, and Hope was thriving, growing plumper and more alert each day. A routine had developed, Ezra hunting and maintaining the cabin, while Sarah tended to Hope and managed the domestic tasks that made their small space feel like a home. But on this particular morning, as Sarah was sorting through her few belongings, she discovered something that would change their understanding of everything that had happened hidden in the lining. Of her old coat, the one she'd worn the night she fled Thomas, was a folded piece of paper she'd forgotten about in the chaos of her escape. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the document, recognizing it immediately as the letter that had started her desperate flight to freedom. "Ezra," she called softly, her voice tight with emotion. "You need to see this." He looked up from where he was carving a wooden spoon for Hope's eventual feeding, noting the strange mix of vindication and fear in Sarah's expression. She held out the letter with hands that shook slightly. "What is it?" he asked, setting down his carving knife. "The proof I've been carrying all along without even realizing it," Sarah replied. "The real reason I had to run when I did." Ezra took the letter and read it carefully, his eyebrows rising as he absorbed its contents. The document was signed by one Jeremiah Phillips, but the handwriting was shaky and the tone desperate. "To whom it may concern, my name is Jeremiah Phillips, though that ain't my real name. I've been living a lie for 3 years now, performing marriage ceremonies I got no right to perform. Thomas Hartwell's father paid me $500 to marry his son to Sarah Caldwell using fake credentials, knowing full well the ceremony wouldn't be legal. I'm dying now, consumption's got me bad, and I can't meet my maker with this sin on my soul. Miss Sarah deserves to know the truth about her situation. She ain't really married, never was, and that means she's free to leave anytime she wants. I'm sorry for my part in this deception. The money seemed like a blessing when I was starving, but I see now it was blood money, payment for helping trap an innocent woman. God forgive me. Jeremiah Phillips, real name Jeremy Potts." The silence in the cabin was profound as Ezra finished reading. Sarah watched his face, seeing her own amazement reflected in his expression. "You knew," he said quietly. "Before you ran, before the baby was born, you knew the marriage was fake." Sarah nodded, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. "The letter was delivered the day my labor pains started. Jeremy, must have paid someone to bring it to me before he died. I barely had time to hide it before Thomas came home. That's why you were so confident about throwing your wedding ring into the fire," Ezra realized. "You weren't making a symbolic gesture. You knew it was legally meaningless." "I knew I was free," Sarah confirmed. "But I also knew Thomas would never accept that truth. He'd rather kill me than let me walk away, legal marriage or not. The only way to protect Hope and myself was to disappear completely." Ezra studied the letter again, noting the date. "This was written almost a month before you showed up here. Why didn't Jeremy come forward sooner? Why didn't he expose the fraud publicly?" "Because Thomas's father would have killed him," Sarah said simply. "Old man Hartwell has more blood on his hands than his son ever did. Jeremy was probably afraid for his life until the consumption made him brave, or desperate enough to tell the truth. The revelation reframed everything that had happened, casting their struggle in a new light. Sarah hadn't been a desperate woman making a blind run for freedom. She'd been someone armed with knowledge, making a calculated escape from a situation she understood completely. "You let me think you were helpless," Ezra said, though there was no accusation in his voice, only wonder. "A frightened girl running from an abusive husband." "I was frightened," Sarah replied. "Terrified. But you're right, I wasn't helpless. I knew exactly what I was doing when I left. I'd been planning it for weeks, gathering supplies, studying maps, waiting for the right moment. And that moment came when you went into labor. Sarah nodded. I knew Thomas would be distracted by the approaching birth, focused on his precious heir. It was my best chance to get away before he could lock me up completely. Ezra shook his head in amazement. You walked 15 miles through a blizzard while in active labor, carrying proof that would expose one of the most powerful families in the territory. No wonder you looked so determined when I opened that door. I had to reach you, Sarah said. Not just any shelter, you specifically. I'd heard stories about the hermit who lived up here, a man who'd once been a soldier and a medic. I knew if anyone could help me deliver my baby safely, it would be you. The implications of her words hit Ezra like a physical blow. You didn't stumble onto my cabin by accident. You came here deliberately. I came here because I knew you were a good man who'd help someone in need, Sarah confirmed. The stories people tell about you in the valley aren't about a crazy hermit. They're about someone who once saved lives, who walked away from the world because he'd seen too much violence. Ezra felt his understanding of their entire relationship shift. Sarah hadn't been a helpless victim who'd trusted him with her life. She'd been a woman making informed decisions, choosing him as her ally because she'd researched his character and found him worthy of her trust. All those times you seemed so grateful for my help, he said slowly. You were really evaluating whether you'd made the right choice. I was grateful, Sarah insisted. More grateful than you'll ever know. But yes, I was also watching, learning, trying to understand the man who held my daughter's life in his hands. Everything I discovered made me more certain I'd chosen correctly. Hope stirred in her makeshift cradle, as if sensing the emotional undercurrents in the room. Sarah moved to comfort her daughter, but her eyes remained fixed on Ezra's face. Are you angry? She asked. That I didn't trust you with the whole truth from the beginning? Ezra considered the question carefully. His initial reaction had been surprise, perhaps even a touch of wounded pride at being manipulated, however gently. But as he thought about Sarah's position, a young woman with a newborn baby, surrounded by enemies, forced to rely on the character assessment of a man she'd never met, he found he couldn't blame her for her caution. I'm impressed, he said finally. You managed a complicated escape plan while giving birth. You protected vital evidence while fighting for your life. You evaluated potential allies and made life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. That takes remarkable courage and intelligence. Relief flooded Sarah's features. I hated deceiving you, even partially. But I couldn't risk telling anyone the whole truth until I was certain they could be trusted completely. And now, Sarah looked around the cabin that had become their sanctuary, at Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle, at Ezra himself, the man who'd risked everything to protect them. Now I trust you with my life and my daughter's life. Completely and without reservation, the letter lay between them on the rough wooden table, a piece of paper that represented vindication and validation, but also new possibilities. Sarah was not just free from an abusive marriage. She was free to make any choices she wanted about her future. What do you want to do with this? Ezra asked, nodding toward Jeremy's confession. Keep it safe, Sarah replied. It's Hope's inheritance, proof that she was born free, that her mother was never anyone's property. Someday, when she's old enough to understand, I'll tell her the whole story. And until then, Sarah moved closer to him, Hope in her arms. The three of them forming a circle around the small table where Jeremy's letter lay, like a bridge between Sarah's past and their shared future. Until then, we build the life we choose, she said simply. Not the life that was forced on me, not the life circumstances seemed to demand, but the life we actively decide to create together. Ezra looked at the letter one more time, then at Sarah, then at Hope. This small person who represented possibility and hope, and the promise that the future could be different from the past. The document Jeremy had left behind was more than just evidence of a crime. It was a declaration of independence, a certificate of freedom that Sarah had earned through her own courage and determination. Together, he agreed, the word carrying more weight than he'd intended. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of their current arrangement. It was a commitment to whatever came next. A promise that the alliance forged in crisis would continue to grow and strengthen in peacetime. Hope opened her dark eyes and looked up at both adults with the intense focus that babies sometimes displayed, as if she were studying their faces and storing the images for future reference. In her gaze, both Sarah and Ezra saw reflection of their own commitment to her safety, to each other's welfare, to the family they were creating from the fragments of their separate pasts. Jeremy's letter had revealed the truth about Sarah's legal status, but the real truth, the one that mattered more than any document, was written in the way they looked at each other, the way they shared responsibilities for Hope's care, the way their individual stories had become intertwined into something larger than either could have created alone. The hidden letter was Sarah's secret weapon, but her greatest strength had always been her ability to recognize trustworthy allies and inspire them to fight for something worth protecting. She'd chosen Ezra not because he was her only option, but because she'd seen in him the man he truly was beneath years of self-imposed isolation. And now, with all secrets revealed and all truths acknowledged, they could begin building something new, not just a refuge from the past, but a foundation for the future. 2 days after Sarah's revelation about Jeremy's letter, their peaceful morning was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. But these weren't the desperate, angry riders of Thomas's final assault. These hoofbeats carried the measured cadence of official authority. Ezra moved to the window and saw a sight that made his blood run cold. Marshal Crawford was riding up the trail, but he wasn't alone. Behind him rode a man in an expensive black suit, flanked by 2 territorial deputies. Even from a distance, Ezra could see the family resemblance in the older man's bearing, the same arrogant posture, the same sense of entitled authority that had marked Thomas Hartwell. "It's Thomas's father," Sarah whispered from behind him, her voice tight with renewed fear. "Silas Hartwell. I should have known he wouldn't let this end with his son's death." In Ezra's hands lay the territorial marshal's badge that Crawford had left behind after the confrontation, not as a gift, but as a symbol of legitimate law enforcement in case further legal complications arose. The bronze star felt heavier than it should, weighted with the authority and responsibility it represented. "Sarah," Ezra said quietly, "take Hope and Jeremy's letter and go to the root cellar. Don't come out until I call for you, no matter what you hear." "I won't hide while you face this alone," Sarah protested. "We're in this together now." "We are," Ezra agreed, "which is why I need you to protect that letter. It's our proof, our evidence. If something happens to me, you take it to the territorial governor. Promise me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and gathered Hope into her arms. "What are you going to do?" "What needs doing," Ezra replied, pinning the marshal's badge to his shirt. The metal caught the morning light, transforming him from mountain hermit to federal officer. "Whatever Silas wants, he's going to get it legal and proper or not at all." The riders pulled up outside the cabin with theatrical precision. Marshal Crawford dismounted first, his expression grim and apologetic. Silas Hartwell followed, a man in his 60s with silver hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. The family resemblance to his dead son was unmistakable, but where Thomas had been crude and violent, Silas projected the dangerous sophistication of someone accustomed to getting his way through wealth and influence rather than brute force. "Marshal Crawford," Ezra said as he stepped onto his porch, the badge visible on his chest. "Wasn't expecting another visit so soon." "Neither was I," Crawford replied, and Ezra caught the warning in his tone. "Mr. Silas Hartwell has petitioned the territorial court for custody of his granddaughter. He's got legal papers, signed by Judge Morrison in Denver." Silas stepped forward, his smile cold and predatory. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume. I understand you've been harboring my son's widow and child. I'm here to take them home where they belong." "Your son's widow?" Ezra kept his voice level, though every instinct screamed at him to reach for his rifle. "I was under the impression there was no legal marriage." a technicality that can be resolved through the proper channels. Silas replied smoothly. The important fact is that the child carries Hartwell blood, which makes her my rightful heir. The courts have recognized my claim as her grandfather and nearest male relative. Ezra looked at Marshal Crawford, seeing reluctant confirmation in the lawman's eyes. Whatever strings Silas had pulled, whatever judges he'd bought or favored he'd called in, he'd managed to get legal authority behind his claim. The child has a mother, Ezra pointed out. Sarah Caldwell is alive and well, perfectly capable of caring for her daughter. Miss Caldwell is an unmarried woman with no means of support, hiding in the wilderness with a man of questionable character, Silas countered. Hardly suitable circumstances for raising a Hartwell heir. The court agrees that the child would be better served in a proper home with adequate resources. The legal trap was elegantly constructed. By claiming Sarah had never been married, Silas could argue she was an unfit single mother. By positioning himself as the concerned grandfather, he could claim moral and legal authority. And by involving the territorial courts, he'd given his power grab the veneer of legitimate law enforcement. You seem to be wearing Marshal Crawford's badge, Silas observed, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. I wasn't aware hermits were eligible for federal appointments. Emergency deputization, Crawford explained quickly. Standard procedure when dealing with ongoing criminal matters in remote areas. And what criminal matters would those be? Silas asked. Though his smile suggested he already knew the answer, Ezra felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could produce Jeremy's letter, expose the fraudulent marriage, and destroy Silas's legal position. But doing so would also reveal that Sarah had possessed that evidence all along, potentially opening her to charges of withholding evidence or conspiracy. Alternatively, he could allow Silas to take hope, trusting that the legal system would eventually sort out the truth. But given the man's obvious connections and resources, that was effectively the same as handing the child over permanently, or he could make a stand here and now, using his temporary authority as a federal deputy to protect an innocent child from a corrupt legal system. The criminal matter of child endangerment, Ezra said finally, his decision crystallizing. Taking a 3-week-old infant away from her nursing mother would constitute deliberate harm to a minor under federal protection. Silas's eyes narrowed. You're overstepping your authority, Deputy. This is a civil matter, properly adjudicated by territorial courts. Federal jurisdiction doesn't apply. It applies when I say it applies, Ezra replied, though he wasn't entirely certain of his legal ground. That child was born under my protection, and she'll stay under my protection until proper procedures are followed. What procedures would those be? Marshal Crawford asked, and Ezra heard both curiosity and hope in the question. A full investigation into the circumstances of Thomas Hartwell's marriage to Sarah Caldwell, Ezra announced, the plan forming even as he spoke, including examination of all relevant documents and testimony from all parties involved. That investigation has already been completed, Silas said impatiently. The marriage was performed by a fraudulent minister, making it invalid. This supports my claim that the child is illegitimate and therefore requires proper guardianship. But it raises questions about who arranged for that fraudulent minister, Ezra countered. Who paid him? Who knew about his lack of credentials? Who benefited from the deception? Those are federal crimes, conspiracy, fraud, possibly kidnapping if it can be shown that Sarah was held against her will under false pretenses. He saw understanding dawn in Marshal Crawford's eyes, followed by something that might have been admiration. Ezra was turning Silas's own legal weapon against him, using the revelation of the fraudulent marriage to open up broader questions about the family's criminal activities. This is preposterous, Silas blustered. But for the first time since his arrival, he looked uncertain. You're making wild accusations without evidence? Then let's examine the evidence, Ezra interrupted. All of it. Every document, every witness, every person who had knowledge of this alleged marriage. Let's see what a full federal investigation turns up. Silas looked at his legal papers, then at Marshal Crawford, then at the badge on Ezra's chest. The mathematics of the situation were becoming clear to him. He'd expected to face a powerless hermit protecting an equally powerless woman. Instead, he was confronting a federal deputy who seemed prepared to drag the entire Hartwell family business into the light of legal scrutiny. "Marshal Crawford," Silas said carefully, "surely you can see that this man is exceeding his authority. A temporary deputization doesn't grant him the power to override territorial court decisions." "Actually," Crawford replied slowly, "it does give him the authority to investigate potential federal crimes. And fraud involving marriage certificates that cross territorial boundaries would definitely fall under federal jurisdiction." Ezra felt a surge of gratitude toward the marshal. Whatever Crawford's personal opinion of the legal maneuvering, he was supporting the play, giving Ezra the backing he needed to make his bluff effective. "I demand to see the child," Silas said, changing tactics. "If she's truly my granddaughter, I have a right to confirm her identity." "No court order grants you access to a nursing infant," Ezra replied firmly, "especially not when there are questions about your family's involvement in potential criminal activities." The standoff stretched taut between them. Silas had money, influence, and legal documents, but Ezra had federal authority and the moral high ground. More importantly, he had the determination that came from protecting something precious, not just Hope and Sarah, but the principle that children shouldn't be treated as property to be claimed by whoever had the most power. "This isn't over," Silas said finally, his cultured mask slipping enough to reveal the ruthless man beneath. "I'll have that child one way or another. She's a Hartwell, and she belongs with her family. Her family is her mother," Ezra replied quietly. "Everything else is just paperwork." As Silas and his men mounted their horses to leave, Ezra felt the weight of what he'd just committed himself to. He'd bought Sarah and Hope time, but at the cost of making himself and his temporary authority the focus of what would undoubtedly be a brutal, legal, and political battle. Marshal Crawford lingered after the others had ridden away, his expression thoughtful. "You know he'll be back with more judges, more papers, more pressure." "I know. And you know that badge is more symbol than substance. Your deputization was never formally processed through Denver." "I know that too." Crawford studied Ezra's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then you also know you'll need real federal backing if you're going to make this stick. I can try to get you official status, but it'll take time, and Silas has a lot of influence in the territorial capital." "How much time?" "Maybe a week if we're lucky. Maybe longer if he starts calling in favors." Ezra looked back at his cabin, knowing that Sarah and Hope were hidden inside, depending on him to keep them safe. A week might be enough, or it might not be nearly sufficient. But it was what they had, and he'd learned long ago to work with the time and resources available, rather than wishing for better circumstances. "Then we'd better get started," he said. "That little girl's future depends on it." As Crawford rode away to begin the process of legitimizing Ezra's authority, Ezra remained on his porch, studying the landscape he'd called home for 20 years. The mountains looked the same as always, eternal, unforgiving, indifferent to human struggles. But everything else had changed, probably forever. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world's complications. He was a man standing at the center of a legal and moral battle that would determine whether justice could prevail over wealth and influence. The badge on his chest might be more symbol than substance, but the commitment it represented was real enough. Sarah emerged from the root cellar with Hope in her arms, her eyes questioning. Ezra looked at his makeshift family, the woman who'd trusted him with her life and the child who represented hope for the future, and felt his resolve solidify into something unshakable. "It's going to get harder before it gets easier," he told them. "But we're going to see this through to the end." Hope gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, oblivious to the storm gathering around her young life. But in her innocent trust, Ezra found all the motivation he needed to face whatever came next. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and protecting this child's right to grow up free was definitely one of them. 5 days later, they came in force. Ezra had been expecting them, but the size of Silas Hartwell's response still took his breath away. From his position at the cabin window, he counted 12 men, territorial deputies, federal marshals, and what looked like hired guns wearing official badges. They rode with the confidence of men who believed they held all the legal cards. At the head of the procession rode Silas himself, no longer bothering with his cultured facade. Behind him came a man Ezra recognized from newspaper illustrations, Judge William Morrison, the territorial magistrate whose reputation for corruption was matched only by his skill at making his decisions seem legally sound. But it was the document the judge carried that made Ezra's blood run cold. Even from a distance, he could see the official seals, the elaborate signatures, the unmistakable authority of federal court orders. "Sarah," he called quietly, never taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "They're back. And this time, they've brought enough firepower to enforce whatever papers they're carrying." Sarah emerged from the cabin's back room, where she'd been nursing hope, her face pale but determined. In her hand, she carried Jeremy's letter, the false marriage certificate that had become their most precious piece of evidence. "Are you ready for this?" Ezra asked, checking his rifle one final time. "I've been ready since the day I ran," Sarah replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "This letter is going to change everything, isn't it?" "It's going to expose the truth," Ezra confirmed. "But the truth doesn't always win in court battles against men with Silas's resources." The riders pulled up in a semicircle around the cabin, their weapons visible but not yet drawn. Judge Morrison dismounted with theatrical dignity, unfolding what appeared to be several legal documents. "Ezra Blackwood," the judge called out in a voice trained for courtroom pronouncements. "By order of the Territorial Court of Colorado and the Federal District Court of Denver, you are commanded to surrender custody of the minor child known as Hope Caldwell to her legally appointed guardian, Silas Hartwell." Ezra stepped onto his porch, the marshal's badge glinting on his chest. "Judge Morrison, I wasn't aware territorial courts had jurisdiction over federal deputies in the conduct of ongoing investigations. Your so-called deputization has been reviewed by proper authorities and found to be without legal standing," Morrison replied smugly. "You have no federal authority, no legitimate claim to protect the child, and no legal right to interfere with properly executed court orders." The trap had been expertly constructed. Whatever strings Silas had pulled, whatever favors he'd called in, he'd managed to neutralize Ezra's federal protection and acquire overwhelming legal authority for his claim. "I demand to see those orders," Ezra said. Though he suspected their validity was unquestionable, Judge Morrison handed over the documents with obvious satisfaction. Ezra read through them carefully, noting the elaborate language, the multiple signatures, the impressive array of official seals. Everything appeared legitimate, properly executed through both territorial and federal channels. "As you can see," Silas said from his position among the mounted men, "the law is quite clear. The child belongs with her family, not with strangers who have no legal relationship to her whatsoever. Her mother has the strongest legal relationship of all," Ezra pointed out, though he could hear the weakness in his own argument. "An unmarried woman with no means of support and questionable judgment," Judge Morrison countered. "The court has determined that the child's welfare requires proper guardianship by her nearest responsible male relative." Sarah stepped out of the cabin, Hope cradled in her arms, Jeremy's letter clutched in her free hand. "Your Honor, I have evidence that changes everything about this case." She held up the document, and Ezra saw Silas's face go white with shock and fear. Whatever the old man had expected from this confrontation, it wasn't the appearance of Jeremy Phillips's deathbed confession. "What kind of evidence?" Judge Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he was already preparing to dismiss whatever Sarah might present. "A letter from Jeremiah Phillips, the man who performed my so-called marriage to Thomas Hartwell," Sarah announced. her voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. Her confession that he was paid by Silas Hartwell to conduct a fraudulent ceremony using fake credentials. The silence that followed was electric. Several of the mounted men exchanged glances, understanding that the legal foundation of their mission had just been called into question. Judge Morrison looked at Silas with obvious concern, while the old man himself appeared to be calculating his options rapidly. "That's preposterous," Silas said finally. "A desperate woman's forgery created to support her illegal flight from lawful marriage." "Then you won't mind if we authenticate the document," Sarah replied calmly. "Jeremy Phillips's handwriting is on file with territorial authorities from his previous arrests under his real name of Jeremy Potts." Ezra felt a surge of pride at Sarah's composed presentation. She wasn't pleading or begging. She was presenting evidence like someone who understood exactly how legal proceedings worked. The weeks of hiding and fear had transformed her into someone stronger, more confident in her own authority. "Even if such a letter exists," Judge Morrison said carefully, "it doesn't change the fundamental facts of the case. The child requires proper guardianship, and Mr. Hartwell is her nearest male relative." "But it does change the question of who arranged the fraudulent marriage," Sarah continued. "And why? If Silas Hartwell paid for a fake ceremony, that suggests conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly to gain control of my father's property through illegal means." Now the real implications were becoming clear to everyone present. What had started as a simple custody dispute was threatening to become a criminal investigation that could destroy the entire Hartwell empire. Furthermore, Sarah added, her confidence growing as she saw the impact of her words, Jeremy's letter explains that the fraudulent marriage was arranged specifically to give the appearance of legality while denying me the actual rights of a wife. That constitutes kidnapping and false imprisonment under federal law. Silas's mask of civilized authority finally slipped completely. "Oh, you ungrateful little witch," he snarled. "I gave you everything, a home, security, respectability. And this is how you repay my family's generosity." The admission was damning. By acknowledging his role in providing Sarah with everything, Silas was essentially confirming that the marriage had been a business arrangement designed to benefit the Hartwells rather than a legitimate union. "Your Honor," Ezra said, addressing Judge Morrison directly, "it seems clear that this case involves significant questions of federal criminal law. I request that all proceedings be suspended pending a full investigation by federal authorities." Judge Morrison looked at the letter in Sarah's hand, then at Silas's increasingly desperate expression, then at the assembled men who were beginning to mutter among themselves. The clean legal victory he'd been promised was deteriorating into a potential scandal that could damage his own reputation. "This is highly irregular," he said finally. "These documents would need to be properly authenticated, witnesses called, expert testimony presented, all of which takes time," Silas interrupted angrily. "Time for these people to disappear again, to destroy evidence, to concoct more lies and forgeries. Then, perhaps," Ezra suggested quietly, "we should resolve this matter right here and now. Sarah has presented her evidence. Let Silas present his. Let's see whose story holds up under scrutiny." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Ezra was calling Silas's bluff, forcing him to either admit his involvement in the fraudulent marriage or provide convincing evidence of his innocence. "I don't have to prove anything," Silas said. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The burden of proof is on the accusers." "Actually," one of the federal marshals spoke up, a man Ezra hadn't noticed before, "when serious criminal charges are alleged, we do have an obligation to investigate, especially when they involve conspiracy and fraud across territorial boundaries." Hope began to fuss in Sarah's arms, perhaps sensing the tension around her. Sarah soothed her daughter with practiced ease, but her eyes never left Judge Morrison's face. "What do you propose?" the judge asked, clearly hoping to find a way out of the legal minefield he'd walked into. Temporary custody remains with the mother while federal authorities investigate the allegations. Ezra suggested. If the marriage was indeed fraudulent and arranged by Silas Hartwell, then his claim to the child is based on criminal activity. Absolutely not, Silas exploded. I won't allow my granddaughter to remain with these criminals while bureaucrats waste months investigating baseless accusations. His outburst was exactly what Ezra had been hoping for. By refusing reasonable compromise, Silas was revealing himself as someone whose interest in Hope was more about control than genuine concern for her welfare. Your granddaughter, Sarah said quietly, assuming she's your granddaughter at all. If the marriage was fake, and if Thomas was never actually my husband, then Hope has no legal relationship to your family whatsoever. The words hit like hammer blows. If Sarah could prove the marriage was fraudulent from the beginning, not just invalid, but deliberately falsified, then Hope wasn't a Hartwell at all in the eyes of the law. She was simply Sarah Caldwell's daughter, with no connection to the powerful family that wanted to claim her. Judge Morrison looked at the papers in his hand with growing uncertainty. Legal documents that had seemed unassailable minutes ago now appeared to be built on foundations of sand. This matter clearly requires further investigation, he said finally, his voice carrying none of its earlier authority. I'm ordering a temporary suspension of all custody proceedings pending review by federal authorities. Silas's face turned purple with rage. You can't do this! I have rights. That child carries my son's blood. If your son was never legally married to her mother, then that blood relationship has no standing in law, the federal marshal pointed out calmly. Mr. Hartwell, I think you'd better come with us. We have some questions about your family's business practices. As the implications sank in, Ezra realized they had won more than just a temporary reprieve. Sarah's letter hadn't just exposed the fraudulent marriage, it had opened the door to a criminal investigation that would likely destroy Silas Hartwell's ability to threaten them ever again. But even as relief flooded through him, Ezra knew their victory was only beginning. Powerful men like Silas didn't go down without a fight, and the legal battle ahead would test every resource they possessed. The federal marshal's words seemed to echo across the mountain clearing as their full meaning sank in. Silas Hartwell, one of the most powerful men in the Colorado Territory, was being invited to answer questions about criminal conspiracy. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. This is preposterous, Silas snarled, his cultured facade finally cracking completely. I'm not going anywhere with you people. I have influential friends, political connections. Had, the federal marshal corrected quietly. Past tense. Your son's death and this fraud investigation have made you radioactive politically. Your friends are distancing themselves as quickly as possible. Ezra watched the confrontation unfold with growing amazement. In his hand, he still held his compass, the military-issued instrument that had guided him through countless battles during the war. But this wasn't a battle of bullets and bayonets. This was something far more complex. A conflict where the weapons were words and documents, where victory went to whoever could navigate the treacherous terrain of law and justice most skillfully. The compass had once helped him find his way through the chaos of war. Now, as he watched Sarah stand firm against overwhelming odds, he realized she had become his compass, guiding him toward a different kind of courage, pointing him toward the man he could become rather than the one he'd been hiding from. Sarah, Judge Morrison said, his tone now conciliatory rather than commanding, if you could provide that letter for official authentication, we could resolve this matter much more quickly. Sarah looked at Ezra, seeking confirmation. He nodded slightly, understanding that the moment of truth had arrived. Everything would depend on whether Jeremy Phillips's deathbed confession could withstand legal scrutiny. Here, Sarah said, stepping forward to hand the letter to the judge. But I want a receipt and I want copies made immediately. This document represents my daughter's future. Judge Morrison examined the letter carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each line he read. When he finished, he looked up at Silas with undisguised disgust. Mr. Hartwell, this letter specifically names you as the person who paid for the fraudulent ceremony. It details the amount paid, the false credentials provided, and the criminal conspiracy to deceive Miss Caldwell about her legal status. How do you respond to these accusations? For the first time since Ezra had met him, Silas Hartwell looked genuinely rattled. The supreme confidence that came from wealth and political connections was crumbling in the face of documented evidence of his crimes. "That letter is a forgery," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "A desperate woman's attempt to escape her legal obligations. Then you won't mind if we compare the handwriting to other documents in Jeremy Phillips's hand," the federal marshal said calmly. "We have extensive samples from his various arrests under different names. Furthermore," Sarah added, her voice gaining strength, "there were witnesses to some of these arrangements. People who worked for your family, who handled the money transfers, who were present when plans were discussed. Are you prepared for all of them to testify under oath?" The trap was complete and everyone present could see it. Silas had built his power on intimidation and corruption, but faced with federal investigation and documentary evidence, his empire was collapsing around him. Even if this letter is authentic, Silas tried desperately. It doesn't change the fact that the child needs proper care. Miss Caldwell is an unmarried woman with no resources. Actually, Sarah interrupted, that's not entirely accurate. My father's ranch, which your family has been managing since his death, reverts to me now that the fraudulent marriage has been exposed. I believe a proper accounting will show that it's been quite profitable under your stewardship. Ezra felt his admiration for Sarah reach new heights. Not only had she preserved the evidence that would destroy her enemies, she'd also thought through the financial implications of her legal victory. The ranch that had been stolen from her through fraud would now provide the resources she needed to raise hope independently. "The Caldwell Ranch," Judge Morrison said slowly, consulting his notes. "Yes, that property has been under Hartwell management for several years. If the marriage that justified that arrangement was fraudulent from the beginning, then the Hartwells have been illegally profiting from stolen property," Sarah finished. "I'll want a full accounting of all income and expenses, plus damages for the years of unauthorized use." Silas's face went from red to white as the full scope of his legal exposure became clear. What had started as a simple effort to claim his granddaughter had become a criminal investigation that threatened to destroy everything he'd built. "This is a witch hunt," he said weakly. "A conspiracy against my family by people who want to profit from my son's death." "Your son died because he tried to murder a federal officer," Ezra pointed out quietly. "Everything that's happened since then has been the natural consequence of that choice." The truth of those words seemed to settle over the assembled men like morning mist. Thomas Hartwell had died not as a victim, but as a man who'd chosen violence over law, who'd preferred destruction to justice. His father was now reaping the consequences of that choice. "Marshal Patterson," Judge Morrison said, addressing the federal officer, "I believe this matter is now properly within your jurisdiction. The territorial court withdraws its custody orders pending resolution of the criminal investigation." Marshal Patterson nodded gravely. "Mr. Hartwell, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, false imprisonment, and theft by deception. You have the right to remain silent." As the marshal read Silas his rights, the old man's empire finally crumbled completely. His hired guns melted away, unwilling to face federal charges for a boss who could no longer pay them. His political allies would soon follow, distancing themselves from a scandal that could destroy their own careers. But Ezra's attention was focused on Sarah and Hope, standing together in the morning sunlight that filtered through the pine trees. Mother and daughter, free at last from the web of lies and corruption that had trapped them. Sarah was crying, but these were tears of relief and triumph rather than fear and desperation. "Is it really over?" she asked, as the last of the officials rode away, taking Silas Hartwell to face justice at last. Ezra looked at his compass one final time, then closed it and slipped it into his pocket. He no longer needed its guidance. He'd found his direction at last, and it led toward the future rather than away from the past. "The legal battle is over," he said. Silas will spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His property will be seized to pay for his crimes, and you'll get your father's ranch back with full control over your own life. And us, Sarah asked quietly. What happens to us? Hope gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, reaching out with tiny hands toward Ezra's face. He offered her his finger, marveling again at the strength of her grip, the trust in her dark eyes. That depends on what you want to happen, he said. You're free now, truly free. You can go anywhere, do anything, choose any life you want for yourself and Hope. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with the same intensity her daughter showed when looking at the world around her. And if what I choose is to stay here? To build a life in these mountains with the man who saved us both? Ezra felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that the isolated hermit he'd been for 20 years had died somewhere in the process of protecting this woman and her child. The man who remained was someone different, someone capable of love, of family, of the kind of connection he'd spent decades avoiding. Then that's what we'll do, he said simply. Together. Hope made a small sound of approval, or perhaps it was just coincidence. But as Sarah smiled through her tears, as the mountains stood eternal and unchanging around them, as their small family faced a future bright with possibility, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The compass in Ezra's pocket had guided him through war and solitude, but Sarah and Hope had guided him home. 6 months later, spring had transformed the mountain landscape into something almost unrecognizable. Where snow had once piled waist-deep around the cabin, wildflowers now bloomed in brilliant patches of color. The bullet holes in the cabin walls had been carefully patched, and the whole structure had been expanded with a proper nursery and additional living space. Ezra stood on his porch, their porch now, watching. Sarah tended to the vegetable garden she'd planted behind the cabin. Hope, now a chubby, alert baby of 7 months, lay in a wooden cradle he'd carved by hand during the long winter evenings. The cradle was his masterpiece, constructed from the finest pine he could find and polished to a soft golden sheen that caught the morning sunlight. She's getting so big, Sarah said. Pausing in her gardening to check on her daughter, Hope had discovered her own hands recently and spent much of her time studying them with the intense concentration of a philosopher contemplating the mysteries of existence. Growing like a weed, Ezra agreed, though his tone carried nothing but pride and affection. Doc Peterson says she's ahead of most babies her age in every way that matters. Doc Peterson had become a regular visitor to their mountain home, making the difficult journey from Silverton once a month to check on Hope's development and Sarah's recovery. The elderly physician had been amazed by how well both mother and child had thrived despite their traumatic beginning. The legal aftermath of Silas Hartwell's arrest had unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. Federal investigators had uncovered a web of corruption and fraud that extended far beyond the fake marriage ceremony. Silas himself was serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison, his vast holdings seized and sold to compensate his victims. Sarah had indeed recovered her father's ranch, along with substantial damages for the years of illegal management by the Hartwells. But rather than move back to the property that held so many painful memories, she'd chosen to sell it and use the proceeds to improve their mountain home and secure Hope's future. I got a letter from Marshal Crawford today, Ezra said, pulling the envelope from his pocket. The territorial governor has officially confirmed my appointment as federal deputy for this district. Apparently, they were impressed by how I handled the Hartwell investigation. Sarah looked up from her garden with a smile that still had the power to stop his heart. Deputy Blackwood. It has a nice ring to it. I'm thinking of turning it down, Ezra said quietly. 20 years of avoiding responsibility, and now everyone wants to give me more of it. What do you want to do? Ezra looked at Hope in her cradle, at Sarah with dirt on her hands from honest work, at the cabin they'd transformed from a hermit's refuge into a family home. The question of what he wanted had become surprisingly easy to answer. I want to be here, he said simply, with you and Hope. I want to watch her grow up, help her learn to walk and talk and make sense of the world. I want to teach her how to track deer and identify edible plants and find her way by the stars. And I want to be the kind of man who deserves a family like this," he added, his voice growing softer. "Someone she can be proud to call father, even if we don't share blood." Sarah set down her gardening tools and walked over to him, her expression serious but warm. "Ezra Blackwood, you've been more of a father to Hope in 7 months than Thomas would have been in a lifetime. Blood doesn't make family, love does, and protection, and commitment to each other's welfare." Hope chose that moment to make one of her babbling sounds, as if agreeing with her mother's assessment. Both adults turned to look at her, marveling again at the perfect little person who'd brought them together and given their lives new meaning. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, settling beside Ezra on the porch steps, "about names and families and what comes next for us." "What kind of thinking?" Sarah reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small object that made Ezra's breath catch. It was a simple gold band, not the wedding ring she'd thrown into the fire months ago, but something new, something chosen freely rather than imposed by fraud and deception. "I've been thinking that Hope deserves parents who are married properly, legally, with witnesses and vows that mean something," Sarah said, her cheeks flushing pink. "And I've been thinking that I'd like those parents to be us." Ezra stared at the ring, overwhelmed by the enormity of what she was offering. For 20 years, he'd convinced himself that he was meant to live alone, that human connection brought nothing but pain and complication. Now this remarkable woman was asking him to take the greatest leap of faith imaginable. "Sarah," he said carefully, "are you sure? We've been through a lot together, but that was crisis and danger. Living together as a real family, day after day, year after year, that's different." "It is different," she agreed. "It's better. It's what I choose, freely and completely, with full knowledge of who you are and what kind of man you've proven yourself to be." She took his hand and placed the ring in his palm. "I'm not asking because I need protection anymore, or because I'm grateful for what you've done, or because I have nowhere else to go. I'm asking because I love you, and because I want to build a life with you, and because I can't imagine Hope growing up anywhere else but here." The words hung between them, like a bridge spanning 20 years of solitude and fear. Ezra looked at the ring, then at Sarah's face, then at Hope sleeping peacefully in her cradle. Everything he'd thought he knew about himself, about what he wanted from life, had been transformed by these two remarkable females who'd knocked on his door during a blizzard. "Yes," he said simply, slipping the ring onto his finger. "Yes to all of it. To marriage, to family, to whatever comes next." Sarah's smile was radiant as she leaned over to kiss him, a gentle celebration of the choice they'd made together. Hope stirred in her cradle, opening her dark eyes to look at the two adults who'd become her world. "Hello, little Hope," Ezra said softly, lifting her into his arms. "How would you like to have a father who's not going anywhere ever?" Hope responded by grasping his finger with both tiny hands, holding on with the determination that seemed to be her defining characteristic. In that grip, Ezra felt the weight of responsibility he'd avoided for so long, but also the joy that came with accepting it freely. The mountains around them stood unchanged, eternal witnesses to the small human drama that had played out in their shadow. But the cabin at their feet was no longer a refuge from the world. It had become the center of a new world, one built on love and choice rather than fear and isolation. As evening approached and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, the three of them sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and rose. Hope babbled contentedly in Ezra's arms while Sarah leaned against his shoulder, both of them marveling at how completely their lives had changed. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked quietly. "Giving up your solitude, taking on the complications of family life?" Ezra considered the question seriously, thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, bitter, isolated, convinced that human connection brought nothing but pain. That man seemed like a stranger now, someone he'd known briefly, but never really understood. Never. he said with complete certainty. "The only thing I regret is waiting so long to discover what I was missing." Hope made a soft sound and settled more comfortably in his arms, completely trusting in his ability to keep her safe and warm. In her innocent faith, Ezra found vindication for every choice he'd made since the night she'd come into the world. The future stretched ahead of them, uncertain in its details, but secure in its foundation. They would face whatever challenges came their way as a family, united, committed, and strong enough together to overcome anything the world might throw at them. And if another desperate soul should happen to knock on their door during some future storm, they would answer with the same compassion and courage that had brought them together. Because that's what families do. They protect each other, and they protect anyone who needs protection, passing on the gift of safety and love to the next generation and beyond. The cradle Ezra had carved for Hope sat empty now, its purpose fulfilled for the moment, but ready to serve again when the time came. Like their love, like their commitment to each other. It was built to last, a promise that some things in this world were permanent, reliable, and worth preserving against all the forces that sought to tear them apart. As the stars emerged in full glory above the Colorado mountains, three people who'd found each other in the darkness settled in for the night, secure in the knowledge that they were home at last.